Hello everyone, my name is John Sierra, and I am a Tolkien scholar, and I'm here to answer your questions about The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, any of other of Tolkien's works, any and all of them, or even just questions about the man himself. And I have to say I've been very happy with the questions I've been getting, with the feedback I've been getting, with the channel growing and whatnot. So let's continue to grow. Hit the subscribe button if you enjoy my content or if you want to see more. And I do, by the way, have more content that is not just my weekly Q&A video. Oh, and I apologize for this video being a day late. I had intended to put it up yesterday, but it's happening today on a Thursday. But we have some great videos coming out. I'm working on two different projects now. One is a project where I used AI technology to cast a new film series based on Tolkien's work. And it was an interesting experience. You'll see some videos coming out about that, or one video probably coming out about that. And then there are some other videos where I'm going to be going over a Tolkien iceberg that was created by somebody on Reddit. And that's actually going to be a series because I wound up going way more in-depth than I had initially thought I was going to. There is a lot of stuff on there. I've only recorded one part of that so far. Well, anyway, let's get to your questions. Now, in the description, there is a link that goes to my Quora account, and that's where you can ask questions. You can also ask questions in a comment, and of course, leave me any and all comments you'd like. I like comments quite a lot. But on Quora is where I pick the answers that I am going to feature in videos. So anyway, let's get to it. Okay. I have 18, I believe. Or 18 or 19. Let me count these up. 1, 2, 3. I have 19. 19 videos. Okay, 19 questions to get through, so let's get to it. So this first question asks, in The Lord of the Rings, are the dead men of Dunharrow invincible? So of course you're referring to the dead men of Dunharrow being the army of the dead. Aragorn and a bunch of others, Gimli, Legolas, and some of the Dunedain go through the path of the dead. They gather up the dead men of Dunharrow. They drive off the Corsairs, and then those guys dissipate. They go away. Are they invincible? I guess it depends on what is your definition of the word invincible. If you mean that they cannot be harmed, well, I guess they are invincible because they're dead. You can't harm them. They're already dead. They can't be killed, obviously. They're essentially ghosts, right? They're bound to Arda because of the oath that they made, and they cannot pass from the world as mortals are meant to do until they fulfill that oath. If you mean invincible as in are they unstoppable, then they are not. They are not. They're not unstoppable. They really only have one power and one power only, and that is to instill great fear in mortals. And this is why, for example, Legolas, who is not immortal, was not afraid of them. He was not afraid to walk the paths of the dead. He was like, well, these guys, they're dead. Who cares, right? It doesn't bother me. He's an elf. He's not afraid of dead mortals. So they couldn't be used against, like, for example, Sauron. That would be very bad. Sauron, I must remind you, is a necromancer. And necromancers, they do things with dead spirits. And, they call it Morgul sorcery. Sauron would have just scooped them up and put them into other creatures and empowered his armies with them. So, what happened is, like I said, they go through the paths of the dead. They gather up the dead men of Dunharrow. They had made an oath long ago to assist the King of Gondor. They did not do that, and they are not allowed to pass from the world until they help the King of Gondor. And in helping Aragorn, he hasn't been coronated yet, but he is the man who will become the King of Gondor, they fulfilled their oath and they dissipated. They passed from the world. They couldn't be put to any more use after that, as Gimli suggested in the film version. They couldn't even be brought to Pelennor Fields, really, as was done in the film version, because once they went to the coast and they drove off the Corsairs of Umbor and they freed the slaves and everything, that was right there fulfilling their oath. Okay. All right, next question. This one asks, if Luthien was the most beautiful of all Eru's children, did her beauty rival that of her mother Melian, or vice versa? So this is a fun one for me, because if you asked Tolkien himself who was the most beautiful, he would say there is nobody more beautiful than Luthien. And he would be very wise to say this because Luthien was based off of his wife Edith. So if he said, no, Galadriel's hotter, I could see Edith giving him a good wall up there. The reality of it is there's no objectively most beautiful character in any work of fiction because, as they say, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. You might find Luthien to be more beautiful than, Melian or Galadriel or Éowyn or whomever, or you might not. And since it's in print, we're using our imagination. So when Tolkien tells you she's the most beautiful, that's what you imagine. And what you imagine as being the most beautiful and what another person imagines as being the most beautiful may be two very different things. I want to bring you back to the conversations between Gimli and Éomer. So when they met, Éomer spoke in ignorance about Galadriel. And he didn't really know anything about her other than some foul rumors that he had heard. And Gimli told him that he will teach Éomer the art of gentle speech when it comes to women, and that he will do this by violent means if necessary. Now, later on in the story, the ring has been destroyed, Sauron's defeated, everybody's partying down at the field of Cormallen. And there is a point now, and keep in mind, this is very important to keep in mind, Éomer is now the king of Rohan, right? And the king of Rohan, Éomer, summons Gimli to him. He asks Gimli to come over, and he asks Gimli, do you have your axe handy? And come to think of it, this isn't the field of Cormallen, this is a little later, but I'm saying that this is after the ring has been destroyed. Because it couldn't have been at the field of Cormallen. But anyway, it was later. Éomer calls Gimli to him and says, do you have your axe with you? And Gimli says something like, well, not on my person, but if I needed to, I could get it. Why? And Éomer says, I have looked upon the Lady Galadriel, and I cannot say that she is the most beautiful woman in the world, because Gimli told him, if you look upon Galadriel, you will say she's the most beautiful woman in all of Middle-earth, and if you do not, I will get my axe, and then there's going to be some real trouble. So at this point, he basically calls him, say, hey, do you have your axe on you? Well, I got to let you know, I saw Galadriel, she's not the most beautiful woman. And you might think that Éomer is sort of like trying to maybe playfully antagonize Gimli at this point. And Gimli even says, oh, I'll fetch my axe then. And I do believe that the intent of the author was that this was not meant to be serious, that this was meant to be funny. That it was, that they're friends now and they're just sort of messing with each other. So Éomer goes on to say that the reason that he cannot say that Galadriel is the most beautiful woman in all of Middle-earth is because he has also seen Arwen, and he thinks Arwen is lovelier than Galadriel. Gimli obviously disagrees, and they come to realize that it's just a matter of opinion. And Gimli says, I see, you have chosen the night, whereas I have chosen the sun. So it's all a matter of perspective. Now, if you notice also that Tolkien, every woman is described as being really, really beautiful, the most beautiful. It's just the way he is. He says the same thing about Arwen that he said about Luthien, and because Arwen and Luthien are kindred spirits, they're both based off of his wife. So I think that it's just the author's way of encouraging the reader to use their imagination. Okay. All right, next up, in The Desolation of Smaug, so this is a movie question, why doesn't Gandalf's sword Glamdring glow when he is in Dol Guldur? Well, it wouldn't have glowed there. Now, I do want to mention that the Peter Jackson films have been a little inconsistent about specifically Glamdring and Orchrist, the swords that Gandalf and Thorin had, respectively. Glamdring especially because it was in The Lord of the Rings, and I don't believe that there was ever a shot of Glamdring glowing. There was the scenes in the Mines of Moria where you saw that Sting was glowing, but you never saw Glamdring glow, and especially when he was facing the Balrog. Now, the Balrog wouldn't make it glow. The reason that these swords glow, they were forged in Gondolin a long time ago, and when you make a magical implement in this universe, you put a little bit of yourself into the work. And what the elves of Gondolin did is they put their hatred into these weapons. Their hatred specifically of Uruks, whether you call them Uruks or orcs or goblins or whatever you want to call them. They're the same foul creatures that were made in mockery of the elves, and the elves hate them for that reason. And that blue fire is the elven hatred of the goblins. And it does that specifically around goblins. It wouldn't do it around a Balrog. However, there were orcs all over the place, so it should have glowed there. Dol Guldur, there were no orcs there, so it wouldn't glow there. So the films are inconsistent about when Glamdring or Orcris glows. But in that moment with Gandalf in Dol Guldur, that was actually correct, because there were no orcs there. Sauron was there, but the elves didn't put their hatred of Sauron into the sword. They put their hatred of orcs into the sword, and Sauron commands orcs, but he did not create them. It's possible that maybe Morgoth would make it glow. Of course, that, no way to tell that. But anyway, that's why. Okay, so here's a good one because, well, it's not a good one. It's a good one because of my explanation that I'm going to give you, I think. And we're going to talk a little bit about fan fiction here. But the question is odd, and I'm going to point that out right at the beginning. The question is, if elves can die of grief, why didn't Thranduil die when his wife was killed? Now, there's a lot of sirens going off in my head when I read out that sentence. But let me address the first thing. There's a big difference between can die of grief, which Tolkien did say that they can do that, and will die of grief, obviously. Elves very rarely die. They're not supposed to die. They usually die in battle or they're murdered or something like that. But to just die, there's only very specific circumstances where that can happen. And they really are undying. They really just go to Valinor. They don't really pass from the world fully. Even though Arda and Aemon are now separate, it's still considered part of the world, right? Evea. They don't go to the timeless halls. They don't ever pass away fully, and they return. And they even get their bodies back after a time. So, dying of grief is a thing that can happen. It doesn't mean that it will happen. Now, secondly, I have to address the idea of Thranduil's wife. Who is she? Who knows? Is she dead? Who knows? We don't really know much about the elves of Mirkwood. They're very mysterious. The only things that we know about Thranduil's family is that he had a father named Orifer, who died during the siege of Barad-dûr, and he has a son named Legolas. Does he have any brothers or sisters? We don't know. What's his mother's name? We don't know. What's his wife's name? We don't know. Is his wife alive or dead? We don't know. Does he have any other children other than Legolas? Does he have any grandchildren? We don't know. There is a lot about Thranduil, and by extension Legolas, that is just a mystery. We don't even know when they were born, for example. We have birth dates, exact birth dates for most of the characters in The Lord of the Rings, even elves. And even when there's not an exact birth date, there's usually a very close range. Like with Galadriel, there's a range of years where she may have been born. But we don't have even that with Thranduil, nor do we have that with Legolas. So we're making an assumption that he had a wife that died. The reality is, when you look at the story and what Tolkien wrote, he certainly must have had a wife, because he has a child, and elves don't really have children out of wedlock ever. It just doesn't happen. So what happened to her? She could be dead. She could be in Valinor. She may have sailed west. She may have left Middle-earth. She could be in Middle-earth, just in a different place. Or she could have been there by his side the whole time and was never mentioned. She could be sitting in the wine room partying, for all we know. We really don't know anything about her. Now, I wanted to talk about fan fiction because I got an interesting comment here from somebody named Starboy. And it's responding to the fact that I had said that we don't know Thranduil's wife's name, and Starboy here is saying, yes, we do know his wife's name. She's named Calathiel, and she was a Teleri elf, and he spun this whole story about who Calathiel is, and where she came from, and what she's all about, and what happened to her. And there were two things that went through my mind when I'm hearing this, or when I'm reading this, rather. One is, I've never heard of Calathiel. And 2, the story of Calathiel is extremely similar to the story of Celebrian, who was a real elf that was, well, not a real elf, but an elf that was in Tolkien's work. There's no such thing as a real elf. And I'm thinking this is just Celebrian's story with the serial numbers filed off, slightly changed here and there. So, where she sailed west and everything. And I never heard of Calathiel. So I looked her up, I Googled her, and it turns out that Calathiel is from a fan fiction, and one written, I guess, so well that Starboy thought it was a real story. And perhaps this is because the page that came up when I looked, and you could try this yourself and look up Calathiel, was a wiki page. Now, it was specifically a fanon wiki. And there are sort of multiple Tolkien wikis, but there is a fandom wiki, which is, I think, called the one wiki to rule them all. Well, it's not the one that I like to use, but that's from Wiki, and they're all called fandom wikis. But if you take that D out, you get fanon, which is a combination of fan and canon, so it's basically a wiki of popular fan fiction. So I had to correct Starboy and state that, no, that was actually a fan fiction. It's not Tolkien. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not a valid story, because Tolkien was not trying to create novels. He was trying to create mythology, and he always intended, and we're going to talk about this a little later, he always intended other minds to expand upon the things that he didn't. So I think the only issue that Tolkien would have had with the story of Calathiel is that it was the same exact thing as the story of Celebrian, basically. It was a little more of an extreme version of it. But anyway, Calathiel's not a canon character. She's a fan character. So I just want to mention that for anybody who came across that and might be wondering. Okay, next question. What is the significance of the fact that neither Bilbo nor Frodo married or had children? So I think it's two different things. And I want to say that Bilbo was sort of a confirmed bachelor. He may have been what we call asexual or aromantic, meaning that he was just not interested in having a wife. And that could very well be true, but there are other factors at play here as well. Even before Bilbo left on his quest, he was 50 years old, he was unmarried, and he was sort of seen as sort of a weirdo in the Shire. Even though he was trying to play that role of the settled hobbit who is just like anybody else and doesn't do anything out of the ordinary, his youth was full of disappearances and wanderings and speaking with elves and things that most people in the Shire, especially that area, Bywater, that he lived in, specifically Hobbiton, did not approve of that sort of thing. And I don't think he was getting very many girlfriends if he was interested. And I just kind of think he wasn't interested. He's sort of just like that. Now, Frodo's a little different. Frodo definitely expresses, we'll say, appreciation of the female form at several different parts of the story. The most notable being Goldberry, whom he seemed to find very attractive. He was very, very, very into Goldberry. Of course, she was a married woman. But and he didn't try anything. He was very much a gentleman in that case. But he definitely made it known to the reader that he found her to be very, very hot. So why didn't Frodo ever get married? I mean, when he came back, it was sort of a different situation. Yes, he had disappeared. He was seen as odd. He didn't age after 33 years old. He was seen to be just like Bilbo 2.0. But then he was also seen as a hero. He was made the mayor for a time until he stepped down. And everybody kind of liked him afterwards. Why didn't he get married? And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that Frodo was traumatized by the war. And if you know about Tolkien, fought in World War I, and he got married, but he probably knew some guys that were like his war buddies that probably were just too messed up from what they saw or what they did, that they couldn't be like a regular person who just gets married and starts a family, right? So Frodo comes back. He's missing a finger. He's poisoned, and he gets sick from that all the time, every year at the same time. He's sometimes in a lot of pain, and he's lost his love for Middle-earth too. He sticks around to write his book, and then that's it. He sails west. So I think that there's two sort of things. Bilbo is representing the kind of guy who's just not interested in a wife, and Frodo's the kind of guy who just never got to have a wife because he's been through too much. He's seen too much. Good question, though. Okay, so this next one was submitted by EB Agent, and EB asks a really interesting question. This is the one from the thumbnail. Is it true that there is a Tolkien story with incest in it? Is the question. And yes, it's true. Now, in some cases, I have to be very careful about the way I word things here. In some cases, it would not be what I would call, or what anybody would call, incest. Maybe some people would. But we have instances of inbreeding between the lines of man. Normally there were very strict rules about this sort of thing, and that you did not marry a first cousin, for example. You would not marry a first cousin unless they were many times removed. Maybe for elves they might do that, right? But generally speaking, they don't do that, and men certainly are not allowed to do that sort of thing, and they don't practice that. There was one character named Maeglin who was an elf who fell in love with his first cousin Indus, and she was like, no, ew. She wasn't interested in her, and he actually turned evil. He joined Morgoth because Morgoth was there saying, you can have her if you tell me where Gondolin is. I'll make it worth your while. She had married Tuor. Arwen and Aragorn are technically speaking cousins. Her father, of course, is Elros, and she had an uncle. Sorry, I already said his name. I messed this up. Her father, of course, is Elrond. Elros is her uncle. Elrond had a brother named Elros who made a choice to be a mortal man, whereas Elrond chose to be an elf because they had human and elf ancestry, and they were asked to make a choice. So Elros is like her uncle, right? And then Elros is a man. And this really shows you the difference between elves and men. If you follow Elros's line about 30 generations down the line, you get Elendil, Isildur, and then if you follow further from that, you have Aragorn. So technically speaking, Aragorn and Arwen are first cousins, but about 60 times removed. At that point, they're so far apart, they might as well not even be related. Another one was Arvedui. Arvedui was a descendant of Isildur, and he married Firiel, who was a descendant of Anarion, and this was seen as the two lines coming together, and why Arvedui tried to become king of Gondor. He was rejected because of their laws didn't really allow that sort of thing. And he had a good claim, and it had to do with the laws of Numenor and everything, but it was rejected by the steward at the time. And they were technically related, but so far apart that they might as well not be related. Now, in an instance where we would actually use the word incest, we do have a situation where a brother married his sister, and this is the tragedy of the children of Húrin. Now, I don't really want to go into the entire story because you absolutely should read the book, The Children of Húrin. It's excellent, but I will give you the broad strokes. So, Húrin was a hero in the First Age. He defied Morgoth, and Morgoth was looking for a way to find Gondolin. Gondolin was a hidden city, and he knew that Húrin was friends with the king of Gondolin. And, of course, Húrin didn't give him what he wanted, so he cursed him. And the way that he cursed him is he put a curse on his entire family, and he made Húrin sit in a chair on the slopes of Thangorodrim and watch the curse take effect. Over the next 28 years, Húrin had to watch his family tear itself apart. There were many tragedies. Now, the brother and sister in this case were Húrin's children, his son, Túrin, and his second daughter, Nienor. Now, he had another daughter, Orwen. She had died when she was very young. She died at 4 years old. So it's tragic right from the start. Now, Túrin went off to live in Doriath with the elves there, and he wound up exiling himself from Doriath due to basically what amounted to a misunderstanding. He accidentally caused the death of an elf there, and he thought that he was going to be kicked out, so he just left. He led the life of an outlaw for many years. He tried to be good, but bad things always happened around him because of the curse of Morgoth. Anybody that he cared for, anybody that he loved, bad things happened, and he just couldn't manage to get his life together. Eventually, he forsook his name, and he started calling himself Tarambar, and he lived with some woodsmen, and he was doing, pretty good there. So this was years and years later, right? This is, closer to the 28 years later. His sister Nienor and his mother, Morwen, had come to live in Doriath, but this was after he had left. And they heard rumor that Túrin was nearby, so they went out looking for him. And what they found instead was a dragon named Glaurung. And Glaurung cursed Nienor. And he made her forget everything, who she was, everything about her life, everything. She was reduced to sort of a primal state. She stripped her clothes off. She ran naked through the woods. She knew nothing but fear. Eventually, she was collapsed and unconscious, and she was found by Túrin, or Tarambar as he was calling himself. And here, he didn't realize that she was his sister because she was an adult, and he had last seen his sister as a little girl, and he didn't quite make the connection between them, especially since it's sort of described that Nienor sort of blossomed into a beautiful young woman, and he knew her like in sort of the awkward child phase, so he didn't, make a connection between this beautiful woman lying naked and unconscious in the woods and his long-lost sister. And of course, she didn't remember even her own name, much less her brother. So he fed her, he clothed her, he took care of her. They fell in love. They got married. They even conceived a child. I don't want to spoil the whole story, but it does end in tragedy. They do find out that they're siblings, and it's not good. To put it in perspective, the story of the Children of Húrin was very influenced by Oedipus Rex, Sigurd the Volsung, and the Corleivros, stories of accidental incest where, like in the example of Oedipus, he marries his mother, and he doesn't realize this, and then when he does realize it, it's not good. Nothing good happens. He's horrified, and so I would recommend you read the book, The Children of Húrin. Excellent book. It definitely doesn't glorify or even condone the act of a brother and a sister marrying. This is seen as an accident of circumstance and something that can only be tragic, right? They did love each other, but they didn't know who each other was. They had no idea, and when they found out, it was bad. So, like I said, I'm trying not to give too many details because it's not a story that everyone is familiar with, but I think that it's one of Tolkien's darkest and most grim stories, and also a really good book that you should definitely buy and read. Okay, moving on. Next question. John Santos asked me this one. If Sauron used the One Ring and all of the Rings of Power, would that help him? Would he become more powerful? I actually got a few different variations of this question all at once. It was kind of interesting. So the Rings of Power they wouldn't give him any powers that he didn't already have. The One Ring, you have to understand the purpose of the One Ring is to control the Rings of Power. So the One Ring really only helps if there are hopefully very powerful people out there holding the Rings of Power, whether they're elves or kings of men or dwarf lords, and that's how Sauron got the Nazgul. The One Ring without the Rings of Power, it doesn't do much. And, I mean, you can, if you're very powerful, use it to command others. But having the Rings of Power doesn't do anything specifically for Sauron. He'd want other people to have the Rings of Power while he held the One Ring. Okay? Let me take a sip of water here. Okay, next question. And this was asked by Nerdmaster200. Who would win in a fight, Voldemort or Melkor? Melkor, of course, is also known as Morgoth. Voldemort's from Harry Potter. In this case, you might as well ask, which is larger, Mount Everest or Jupiter? There's a big difference in power and scale here. Now, for the purposes of matching the cosmologies, there's no reason to say that Melkor is not known in the Harry Potter universe, but he would be called Lucifer. Melkor was the head angel who turns against the Iluvatar and created the concepts of evil and discord. Voldemort is a noseless weirdo who mutilated his soul in a vain attempt to become immortal. And he only lived to be something like 70 years old, when in that world, wizards generally live 100, 150 years. He would have lived twice as long if he just exercised, right? So knowing the way that wizards work in that capacity, he he's kind of not that smart, right? He could have lived a much longer time, but he chose conflict. He chose this attempt at immortality that didn't really work out for him. So Voldemort would be like just a blip on the radar to Melkor. He wouldn't be able to tell the difference between Voldemort and any other sorcerer out there, right? If Voldemort tried to impress Melkor with the sort of magic that is happening in Harry Potter, it's very flashy, very showy magic, and I think Melkor would be, well, that's all good. Why don't you go out and kill some elves for me? But if there was a fight, Melkor wouldn't even fight him. Like, why would he bother? He wouldn't even bother with Feanor. Why would he bother with Voldemort? He would have a Balrog do it, and the Balrog would win. I have to tell you, you know? That instant kill spell only works if it actually hits something. So, okay, next up. This question. How come Sauron didn't... Oh, I get this one all the time. I'm glad I wanted it. Yeah. How come Sauron didn't feel it when Frodo put on the One Ring? I get this a lot. And this is almost as common as why didn't they take the Eagles to Mordor? That kind of question. So, Sauron doesn't have ring radar. He can't tell when somebody else wears the One Ring, right? And notice that I said wears the One Ring. I didn't say uses the One Ring, because there's very, very clear distinction there. If Sauron sensed every time somebody just slipped the ring onto their finger, he would have sensed it in Frodo. He would have sensed it in Bilbo. He would have sensed it in Smeagol. He would have sensed it in Isildur. He would have known where the ring was the first time that Smeagol put the ring on. And Smeagol used it more than Sauron did, I think. Maybe not, but he used it quite a lot, you know. So, in the Third Age, Sauron thought the ring was either gone for good, or maybe he thought it was destroyed. He didn't know what would happen to him if the ring was destroyed. Otherwise, he would have been a lot more proactive in protecting it. So, once he finds out that it's still around, he does want it back, obviously. It's a useful tool for him, but he doesn't have ring radar. There are sort of two instances where he senses something's going on. One is when Frodo sits on the Seat of Seeing at Amon Hen near the Falls of Rauros, and this is because Frodo is sitting in a magical chair while wearing the One Ring, and he uses this Seat of Seeing to see far and wide, and he does cast his gaze to Mordor, and he sees Sauron, and Sauron doesn't necessarily see Frodo, but he senses something's going on in that area, and he starts to investigate. Frodo takes the ring off. Sauron sort of misses him. We later learn that Gandalf also had something to do with protecting Frodo in that instance, but it was less about Frodo wearing the ring and more about the Seat of Seeing and looking towards Sauron. Sort of like how Sauron is able to ensnare people who look his way using the Palantir. Saruman used the Palantir to look all over the place, but it was once he cast his gaze towards Sauron that he was ensnared by him. The other time was at Samath Naur in Orodruim. That's the Cracks of Doom. In Mount Doom, Frodo was detected. Now, there's three different things that make this a special exigent circumstance. One, he claimed the ring as his own. He had never done that before. Two, he did this at the point of the ring's creation where it was at its most powerful, and this is important, it was within Sauron's domain. When Frodo and Sam cross the sort of border, they come out of Cirith Ungol and they come down the slopes and they are finally in Mordor. They realize something's changed and that it would be very unwise to wear the ring while in Mordor. Lastly, number 3, Frodo used the ring. He didn't just wear it, he used it. Before he even claimed it, he used it, and he wasn't even wearing it. He used its power to dominate Gollum, and he issued him a command: back off. If you ever touch me again, you will be cast into the fire. And that actually did happen, because Gollum did attack him. He bit his finger off, he took the One Ring, and then boom, a minute later he's in the fire. So when you look at this, it's no wonder Sauron saw that. All the other instances of just putting the ring on, he wasn't in Mordor. he wasn't using its true power, and he wasn't claiming the ring as his own. And as we're using the true power, like, Frodo shouldn't have been able to do that under normal circumstances, but I think it was because he was at Sam of Numenor. I think anybody could have used the ring in that way. Galadriel instructs him upon the true use of the One Ring to dominate others, and she tells him that the only way that he would be able to do that is to become more powerful and to train his mind to dominate others, right? And in that moment, the ring is so bursting with Sauron's power that Frodo's able to use it on Gollum. Sam sees this, and that's how you know he wasn't actually wearing the ring, because Sam saw it. Sam was sort of the focal character for quite some time, especially in Book 6, and he sees Frodo and Gollum as two figures that are sort of changed. He sees Frodo bathed in white light and holding a wheel of fire. That's the One Ring. He wasn't wearing it, but he did use its power. You don't need to actually slip it under your finger to use it, especially at Sammath Naur. Okay. Next question. This was asked by Alton Tan, and he asks, can Gandalf, in his most powerful form, beat Sauron? If you ask Gandalf, he'd tell you no, right? Gandalf didn't think so. Regardless of how powerful Gandalf ever became, he didn't have a whole lot of confidence in himself. He never saw himself as being the guy that can go toe-to-toe with Sauron. He feared him. He had great fear. When Gandalf was, for lack of a better term, younger, when he was Olorin in Valinor, he was asked by Manwë to go to Middle-earth along with the other spirits. Iwendell wasn't chosen yet. He was chosen slightly after Olorin, but Curanir, who we know as Saruman, and Alatar and Palando, the Blue Wizards. So we would know them as like Ramastano and Morenitar, other way around. But he was asked to go, and Gandalf actually said no. He said he was afraid, and that he was weak, and he felt that Sauron was too powerful, and he did not want to go. He asked to be excused. And Manwë told him, this is why you must go. Now, is Manwë saying that Gandalf must go to Middle-earth because he's weak and afraid? Or is he saying that Gandalf's humility is the key, and that's why he must go? And I think that's closer to the truth. Saruman, Curanir, he had what you might say is an abundance of confidence. He was prideful, even arrogant. Even back then he was. And Gandalf was sort of the opposite. This is also why Radagast was chosen, too, because Radagast was sort of a counterpart to Saruman. Gandalf is meek, right? At least back then he was very meek, and he didn't know his own strength. Now, Sauron predates on fear. So I think that from Manwë's perspective, if some of the Ainur are afraid of Sauron, that's a big issue for him. That's not a good thing. Now, you mentioned the most powerful iteration. Now, Olorin was certainly his most powerful iteration, but on Middle-earth, where Sauron actually is, his most powerful iteration would be Gandalf the White. And when we first meet Gandalf the White in Fangorn Forest, along with Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas, this is what happens. I'm going to read a passage here. The others looked at him. A gleam of sun through fleeting clouds fell on his hand, which lay now upturned on his lap. They seemed to be filled with light as a cup is with water. At last he looked up and gazed straight at the sun. The morning is wearing away, he said. Soon we must go. Do we go to find our friends and to see Treebeard? Asked Aragorn. No, said Gandalf. That is not the road you must take. I have spoken words of hope, but only of hope. Hope is not victory. War is upon us and all our friends. A war in which only the use of the ring could give us surety of victory. It fills me with great sorrow and great fear, for much shall be destroyed and all may be lost. I am Gandalf, Gandalf the White, but black is mightier still. Now, at this point in the story, Sauron's not exactly bringing his A-game either. His physical form had only recently been manifested. He was building his armies, building his power, and he was missing several powers of his own, such as the One Ring, or his ability to take fair form. And of course, he's in Mordor and basically refuses to come out of Barad-dûr. So in this moment, I believe, because you're asking my opinion, that Gandalf the White, pitted against Sauron as he was in that moment, head-to-head, one-on-one, I think Gandalf wins. But it's not one-on-one. It doesn't work that way, right? That's why he says black is mightier still. Sauron doesn't only have his own powers, he has an army. He has many dark creatures. He has great magic. And this is why Gandalf has to muster the forces of good and get all the men and the elves and everybody together to fight. And it was a war that could not be won, that they would lose inevitably unless Frodo's goal is achieved. Only the destruction of the One Ring is really going to not destroy him, but bring him so low that he cannot come back. Because if Gandalf marched out to Barad-dûr and said, "All right, Sauron, you and me, no armies, no weapons, let's just wrestle," maybe he'd win, right? But would that get rid of Sauron, or would it just, hand him another defeat that he would eventually come back from? So that's why it had to be the way it was. Okay. Next question is from Matthew Rowe. Matthew asks, what do you think Galadriel did when she returned to Aman? She had no kingdom there. Would she just live in her father's kingdom and be a princess? She didn't really have the highest seniority there as royals go. Yeah, you're right, and I think that's actually the point. I think that's actually the entire point of what happens with Galadriel. Galadriel was an exile. She didn't take part in any kinslaying. She didn't murder anybody. She didn't steal any ships. She didn't really do anything wrong in Valinor. Her only wish was to see Middle-earth and to perhaps found and rule a fair kingdom there. In Aman, she was never going to be a queen. She was never going to rule anything. The elves are immortal. They don't have a system where the king dies and is replaced by the next in line. Finwë was supposed to be the king of the Noldor, and that's it, right? Finn was killed. He's still the king of the Noldor, right? Except that he refuses to come back because elves can come back from the halls of Mandos. He stays there. So Feanor is the king. Feanor leaves, right? And then there's the whole High King of the Noldor off in Middle-earth. But in Aman, with Feanor and all his sons go, it passes to Finarfin, right? And then even if Finarfin died or something, or he could no longer be the king, Galadriel still has 3 brothers that are older than her, Finrod, Angrod, and Aegnor. And they, would all be ahead of her in this sense, but she has this wish to rule, and that's why she left Aman. Now, her wishing to rule, it's not a high crime like kinslaying, but it's a prideful act that the Valar are not fond of. The War of Wrath happens. They decide, let's forgive the Noldor, let's welcome them back, right? Except for certain ones, like Fëanor's sons, certainly not allowed back. Galadriel, not allowed back. Interesting that they chose her, right? She had to prove that being good was more important than being queen. And this is what happens when Frodo comes along and says, I have the ring, I will give it to you if you ask me for it. And she wants it. She admits as much she wants the ring. Because she sees this little guy with this very powerful evil artifact, and he's going on this fool's quest that has almost no chance of success to destroy it. If he fails, which is extremely likely, her kingdom falls. Sauron regains the One Ring. She can't use her ring anymore. Now, her ring is what's keeping her kingdom fair. It's making it sort of like the Undying Lands. It's keeping it free from the ravages of time. That's the reason that Lothlorien was so wonderful. It was because of the power of the ring of power that Galadriel bore. She would have to take it off. She could not use that power any longer. And then they would be overwhelmed by Sauron's forces. Now, let's say Frodo does succeed. It still doesn't work out really for Galadriel, because then she theorized that with the One Ring gone, all of the rings of power would lose their power. And she was right. She turned out to be 100% right. And then her kingdom fades slowly over time, but it fades anyway. So the only way that she could keep her kingdom is by taking Sauron's power for her own, right? The One Ring. She chooses not to do this. She would rather be good than be the queen, and this is why she's welcomed back into Valinor. It's no longer important for her to be a queen, and she passes to the west. That's why she said, I have passed the test. I will pass to the west and remain Galadriel. She will no longer be Queen Galadriel, but just Galadriel. So that's why it's important that she diminishes herself in that sense. Good question, though. Okay, next question. This is from John Santos, and he asks, since Morgoth is chaos and Sauron is order, and their views sort of intercede in that way, if they won, would there be a betrayal? Would they fight each other? Perhaps, but I don't think so. I honestly don't think so. The concepts of chaos and order do seem antithetical to each other, that they oppose each other, and that they would turn on each other like that. But I think that they help each other meet their goals in a lot of ways. Now, if we look at Melkor, or Morgoth, the concept of chaos to him is really just discord. It's evil. He wants Iluvatar to suffer. He wants the Valar to suffer. He wants the elves to suffer. Sauron wants to bring order. He wants to bring everything to heal and to work in this clockwork way. He wants them all to be slaves and thralls and to be under him. And that also fulfills the goal that Melkor has. If Sauron's ruling everything, then the elves are suffering, the free people, all of them are suffering, and Iluvatar is suffering, and the Valar are suffering. There's a lot more overlap there than you might think. They have goals, and working together helps them achieve those goals. And if they do achieve those goals, Sauron's happy because he sees everything working the way that he wants it to. Everything's industrialized, everything's lockstep. He is the ruler of everything. Or Melkor is, but Sauron's probably allowed to just lord over everything. And then Melkor is happy because he won. Right? He has marred Iluvatar's creation, which is something he was told he was unable to do. So in that event, I don't think they would start fighting each other, no. Okay. All right, next question. Is it true that when Sauron allowed himself to be captured by the Numenorians, he basically became the steward to Pharazôn the Golden and taught him many dark things? Yeah, that's exactly right. That's 100% true. And we have reason to believe that Sauron, that was his plan all along. He didn't like the Numenorians. He hated them. And Pharazôn was a very prideful king. He captures Sauron. Sauron surrenders to him, actually. And he starts thinking he's the greatest king ever. He captured Sauron, and he brings him back to Numenor. And Sauron seems to reform. He feigns goodness. And Pharazôn's thinking, my God, not only did I win, but I turned him good. Sauron starts calling himself Tar Mairon, which means the Admirable King. Mairon is actually his true name. But the Tar part is interesting because he's saying I'm the king, right? He's in Numenor. He's seductive. The king is prideful. It's a bad mix, right? He starts off as a captive, but he feigns goodness. He's released. He walks among the people. He seems fair and good, and he seems to have completely mended his ways. And so, in that way, from Numenor's perspective, they have completely conquered the evil, right? He starts a cult, though. Now, and this is because the Numenorians, their lifespans were getting shorter. Elros lived to be 500 years or so, right? Then you go all the way down to Aragorn, who lived to be 210. So you can see there was a waning of that long life that they had over time. And not all of the Numenorians were descended from Elros. There were those who wouldn't normally live that long anyway. They had longer lives than, the lower men of Middle-earth, but they were not as long-lived as Elros's line. So they were jealous. They wanted to be like the elves. They wanted to be immortal. They wanted to live in Valinor. And Sauron starts telling them, you can have your longer lifespans or even extend them or become immortal if you start worshipping Melkor. So he starts a cult. He gets the king involved. He tells him, let's go attack Valinor. You should go attack Valinor. Take that land for yourself. And Pharazôn is prideful enough to think this will actually work. Of course, it leads to the destruction, the downfall of Numenor, the Akalabeth, So that was really Sauron's plan all the time. Like, have Numenor just tear itself apart. And he did it by pretending to be good. That's like his real power. Okay, next question. Why was Smaug killed by one single arrow? I mean, anybody could be killed by a single arrow, right? It struck him in the heart, right? That you don't survive that. Smaug was struck on the only part of his underbelly that lacked the plating, the gold, the silver, and the jewels that had stuck to his skin. Normally, dragons are very vulnerable there, but he had that extra protection. Now, it was described in The Hobbit as left breast, where the foreleg was flung wide. So you can imagine the arrow coming in kind of from the side, right here. And that's what, like in hunting, they would call that a kill shot. It strikes the heart. It strikes the lung. He's dead. He doesn't survive that. Furthermore, we know that it went all the way in. The arrow plunged into him and disappeared. It went all the way in. It was a powerful shot. So there's no coming back from that. It has nothing to do, by the way, and I got comments about this, that the black arrow was anything special. It was something from the films, really. The black arrow was special in the sense that it was an heirloom of Bard's house, and it may have been made in Erebor. It may have been forged by the dwarves, right? But it wasn't like some special dragon-slaying arrow. Anything that hit him there with enough force and power was going to kill him. It's just Bard was lucky enough that he was in the right place at the right time, and that the old thrush told him the weakness that it had heard from Bilbo. All right, moving on. Let's see. If Sauron was the greatest of the servants of Morgoth, how could Carcharoth be the mightiest wolf? Carcharoth. Okay, interesting. Sauron was only a wolf part-time, if you think about it. He was a shapeshifter. He had many forms: a wolf, vampire, serpent, dark lord, naked spirit, all sorts of different things. So he was the greatest servant of Morgoth because he had all these abilities. Carcharoth was Carcharoth was the greatest wolf because that's all he was a werewolf, right? Whereas Sauron was sometimes a wolf, but he could also be many other things and do many other things. He could do things that the wolf could not. So that's why. Okay, next question asked by John Santos. Could Aule have created rings of power to help the free folks in their struggle against the Dark Lord? Yeah, of course he could have, but it wouldn't have worked. It would have failed, and I'll tell you why. The whole idea of rings of power had quite the negative connotation, and for a very good reason. Aule could have made rings that had nothing to do with the One Ring, weren't bound to it, and they could have been very powerful, and they could have been very helpful. However, who was going to deliver them? The Valar don't directly go to Middle-earth, and any emissary would have basically been shunned because of what happened in the Second Age, whether it was a Maya or an elf. You know, when Sauron came to Eregion and called himself Anatar, he appeared to be an elf, and he said he was sent by the Valar. They fell for it, and they made the Rings of Power, and of course that led to disaster and the fall of Eregion. Do you think that anybody is going to fall for that a second time, right? Not that it's deceptive if it's coming from Aule, but if some person says, hey, I'm from the Valar, I got Rings of Power, I say, get out of here, man. You ain't falling for that again. It wouldn't have worked. So, okay, let's see, next question. This is from Alejandro Hernandez, who asks, had Morgoth returned to Middle-earth, would Sauron step aside in favor of his old master? Yeah, in an instant. He would be very happy to have Morgoth back. And this already kind of happened, too, but in the Years of the Trees, Morgoth was chained and brought to Valinor and chained for 3 ages. And Sauron was in Middle-earth, right? And he went right back to being the lieutenant after Morgoth returned. So if it happened again, if Morgoth managed to come back from the Void, he would have taken over. It would have been... It seems odd, right? It seems odd that, like, 'cause Sauron's been the sole bad guy, not the sole bad guy, but the chief bad guy, in charge of everything for so long. If his master comes back, do you think he might be a little jealous? Oh, no, I gotta be the number 2 guy again. No, I don't think so, and I'll tell you why. Because he wouldn't want to make an enemy out of Morgoth. Morgoth's powerful. Now, it is true that Sauron at his peak was said to be greater than Morgoth at his nadir. However, that doesn't mean that Morgoth is so weak that he wouldn't cause a lot of problems for Sauron were they to get into that sort of conflict. And why would Sauron want to fight a war on 2 fronts? He would be fighting the Free Peoples and Morgoth. Their goals are better met if they team up. Okay. Right. This is one that I've been... This is one hell... just the wording of this is really wild. So let me talk about this. And I also want to talk not only about this question and my answer to this question, but about some of the comments that I got, and one comment in particular that I want to highlight. Why did the Tolkien estate betray Tolkien by signing the Amazon Rings of Power deal? Wow, okay, so I only want to briefly touch on the ridiculous hyperbole. It's nonsense that a television show that you didn't care for is betraying Tolkien. It's ridiculous, right? Get over it. You really need to get over it. Rings of Power was something that happened. Some people liked it, some people didn't like it. And believe it or not, more people liked it than disliked it. Believe it or not. No matter how loud the people that dislike it get, they're still lesser. That doesn't mean that their opinions are worthless. It doesn't mean that they're wrong. But there seems to be a concerted effort by them to seem like everybody agrees with them and that this is the consensus that we've all reached. And that's not the case. Was Rings of Power perfect? No, it was certainly not. It had some issues, particularly with costume design. But was it terrible? No, I don't think it was terrible. It was fan fiction. We talked a little bit about the nature of fan fiction earlier, and I'm going to talk more about it when I highlight the comment that I got. But let me answer the actual question that's at the heart of all that hyperbole and all that nonsense. Why did they sign that deal? Why would they do that? There's two big reasons. And the first is you may have heard of. The astronomical amount of money brought to the table was part of it, but it was actually not the whole part of it. Amazon's bid for the television rights to The Lord of the Rings was the smallest of the three chief bids that they got. They got a larger bid from HBO and a larger bid from Netflix. HBO wanted to make something like the Game of Thrones, and the Tolkien estate was not interested in that. Netflix's pitch was to make something more like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, just for Tolkien, and they were even less interested in that. Amazon comes with a smaller amount of money, not a small amount of money, just smaller relatively. It was still a dump truck of cash. It was still a lot. And they said, we don't really have a plan as of yet. We're going to figure something out. We're thinking that we're going to tell a story about the Second Age, and we want your help. We want you to be involved. We want you to have a say. And this was what was attractive, that the Tolkien estate would get to have some creative say over the show, and they did have creative say over the show. Is that a betrayal of Tolkien? No, and I'm going to talk about that more when I get to the comment and my reply to that comment. But let me get to the second reason why they did this, because the creative say and the money was only one thing. The other thing is, look at the timing. The Rings of Power debuted last year in September of 2022. What was released 2 months later? Do you know that? I bet some of you do. It was a new book from J.R.R. Tolkien, The Fall of Numenor and Other Tales of the Second Age. Very, very interesting timing there, right? The Fall of Numenor is the latest Tolkien work to be put out, to be published, edited. It was edited by Brian Sibley. And it's amazing that we're still getting, a new Tolkien novel 49 years after his death, right? So, and it's the only novel that is entirely made up of content that deals with the Second Age. It was the most neglected part of Tolkien's timeline. We have plenty about the First Age, we have plenty about the Third Age, and we have plenty about the Years of the Trees, and before that, right? But we don't really have a lot about the Second Age. A lot happened, but we only have a broad strokes sort of approach. So suddenly there's a show taking place in the Second Age, and there's a book that comes out 2 months later when the show is already put out its first season. I mean, the timing is almost exactly when the last episode aired and the book came out, right? So I want to read you a quote from Sean Gunner. He's the head of he's the chairperson of the Tolkien Society. He said, "This is an absolute delight for Tolkien fans to enjoy. Whether you're new to Tolkien's works through the Amazon series or have been an avid reader for decades, this edition will take you through the dark age of the Second Age and show a different side of Middle-earth to the one familiar to all of us, and all illustrated by Alan Lee. This isn't just about Sauron and the forging of the rings. This is about the rise and fall of the great island kingdom of Numenor and the history that underpins the world of the Lord of the Rings we all know and love. If you love Tolkien, or if you love the Amazon series, this book is for you." So, very obvious timing there with the book, and also very specific wording, if you love this or if you love that, because there are people that are going to choose one or the other, and there are people that love both, right? But either way, this book's for you, is what he's saying. So, yeah, not only do they get an increased footprint of the Lord of the Rings being out there, but they're releasing a new book that might have flown kind of under the radar, like the previous effort. The Fall of Gondolin didn't make a huge splash in popular culture. But The Fall of Numenor has this show to back it up, so that's actually rather important. They really knew what they were doing. Now, I had an issue with some of the comments here because some people were just there to attack the show, and that's not really what we're talking about, right? And some people have valid critiques, and some people don't, and that's sort of beside the point. But I got one really interesting comment here. Let me see if I can bring this up. There's a lot of comments in here to sort of go through, especially regarding the nature of adaptation. And I said that we were going to talk about the idea of fan fiction, which is important. Unfortunately, I'm not finding it. I will find it. It's a little difficult to find because... Oh, I found it. It's actually the first thing up here. So, Bill Weldon here, and this is a really good comment. He said, I'm going to read this exactly verbatim. He said, I hear the phrase fanfiction thrown around as a criticism, but Tolkien's Legendarium was designed as a framework for fan fiction. And he puts in a quote from Tolkien, I would draw some of the great tales in fullness, and leave many only placed in the scheme and sketched. The cycles should be linked to a majestic whole, and yet leave scope for other minds and hands, wielding paint and music and drama. So then we're coming back to what Bill is saying. And it was designed that way because that's how mythology works. King Arthur is fan fiction. Robin Hood is fan fiction. Homer wrote fan fiction based on stories from the Bronze Age. You know what else was fan fiction? Almost everything that Tolkien wrote. The story of Kullervo explicitly, but all the rest of it grew out of his love of Germanic mythology. His languages were linguistic fan fiction. And if his work was to become mythology as he imagined, his ownership of it would end when he passed away. Courtesy, at least to living authors, he wrote, contrasting himself in that moment with the others, such as Lonrot and Sturluson, from whom he draw his inspiration. And now he has joined them. I'm pretty sure his name will stand out from theirs from this day forward. And I'm going to read you my reply and my thoughts on this verbatim. What I wrote was, the slavish devotion to canon and only accepting adaptations or works by other authors that are exactly in line and never contradict anything that Tolkien wrote is, I believe, a fault of Christopher Tolkien. He was like his father in many ways, but if he had his way, the movie rights would never have been sold unless he was able to stand over every person every step of the way and make sure that it was exactly right in his eyes. Simon Tolkien, by comparison, understands the point that you had made, that Tolkien's framework was always supposed to allow other authors and other visions. I'm adding that part here. He wasn't creating a series of novels in his mind, but a mythology that was wholly English, so it was ever in his thought that other English authors could expand it, comment on it, retranslate it, or even wholly contradict it, as some Arthurian legends do contradict others. Because that is the nature of myth and legends. I'm glad you, for one, get it. And I just, kudos to Bill for really understanding that. The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, is not the Silmarillion or the Fall of Numenor or the Lord of the Rings. It's not Tolkien's work, but it's a take on it. It's a legend in that work. You could even say that it does fit in with Tolkien's work despite the contradictions because it's a story of the Second Age. All of the stories that you read are a perspective of somebody writing it in universe, whether it's Frodo or Bilbo. Usually it's Bilbo. Bilbo with the Silmarillion and the great works, Beren and Luthien, the Fall of Numenor, the Fall of Gondolin, and Children of Húrin are all translations of Elven lore. That's Bilbo's take on it. That's how he translated it. And even there are several versions of each story, some of which contradict each other. There's several versions of the Fall of Gondolin. There's several versions of Beren and Luthien. There's versions of the Children of Húrin that are different and contradict each other. Because even Bilbo had different takes on different things. So the Rings of Power could be somebody else in Tolkien's universe telling a story about how it happened, right? And it exists wholly separately, And I think that you have to look at any adaptation in that sense, especially of Tolkien's work, but really any adaptation in general, that we want it to be like what we love, because that's why we endeavor to see it, right? But at the same time, we have to understand that anything that is not the author's vision, or the author's vision as seen through the filter of the consumer who is consuming his words and seeing things through that lens. Your imagination and the way that you imagine things to look and how people speak and how things happen. It's different for everybody. And if you see a completely different take on it, you may take offense to that. But I think that is disingenuous to take offense to that, because that's just somebody's take on the mythology. Like even in the Christian works, in the Bible, in the Gospels, there are several different contrasting stories of the same event, the crucifixion. And they all basically tell the same events, but not in the same order. Different words come out at different times, because it's several different people telling the story as they remember it, right? So that's sort of like the way to think about it, right? To be dogmatic, like Christopher Tolkien was, I think is doing yourself a disservice, because you're not opening yourself to the idea of mythology. You're seeing it as dogma. And I think that, like I said, Christopher did a lot of great work. He really did. But he also did a little bit of harm in the way that he did not allow himself to make creative decisions regarding his late father's work, because he was afraid of altering it in any way. He was dogmatic, whereas Tolkien himself had so many different versions of everything. And sometimes a decision has to be made, which is the true story. And all of those old ones got published eventually. Well, not all of them, but a lot of old versions got published in the History of Middle-earth. So the History of Middle-earth will give you a version of Huan that's a Maya instead of a dog. The History of Middle-earth will give you a version of the fall of Gondolin where Tuar kills 5 Balrogs. That didn't happen in the Silmarillion. It didn't happen in the book The Fall of Gondolin. But it happened in a version of the Legendarium. So the Rings of Power is a version of it. It's not from Tolkien, it's from Amazon. And if you want to enjoy it, you have to approach it like that. Just like Peter Jackson's movies are not Tolkien's vision, they're Peter Jackson's vision, you know? So, yeah, it's gotten a little weird with the Rings of Power in the Amazon series. I think fans, not most fans, I really don't think it's most fans, I think it's a certain very, very vocal type of fan that is very loud about this series for reasons of their own that I'm not going to get into fully, because I do know some of these reasons, and I think some of these reasons are really what I would call aggressively silly. I'm not saying that the series is beyond reproach. It has its issues. It's not perfect. I, for the most part, enjoyed the first season. I had some issues with a few things here and there, but it's a different take. And you have to sort of let it go. You have to sort of unclench a little, I think. Unclench, relax, right? Maybe Tolkien would have rolled his eyes upon seeing it, right? But he wouldn't have said the things that people are saying. That's important. He would have said, well, that's not my take on it, right? You have to understand that Tolkien was very humorful about himself and his work in a lot of ways. And there are so many contradictions even within his work that he tried his hardest to get rid of all the contradictions, all the inconsistencies, all the issues. And after a while, he realized, with a work this vast and this complex, it's never going to happen. I've done the best I could. I'm going to stop now for my own sanity. And he said that it would be an amusing, what was the word he used? I think, well, it wasn't hobby, pastime, an amusing pastime for readers to find these inconsistencies and to come up with reasons why they're not inconsistencies or why there are inconsistencies. And it's almost always Bilbo mistranslated or something like that, you know. Okay, one last question, and this harkens back to the Thranduil question earlier. I probably should have put them together, but this person asks, who was Galadriel and Celeborn's child? So, they had a daughter named Celebrian. Celebrian married Elrond, and they had 3 children in the Third Age. They married in the Second Age, but they had their children in the Third Age, Elladan and Elrohir, who I believe may have even been twins, and then there was Arwen slightly later. Celebrian got the Elisar from her mother. the origin of the Elisar, by the way, there's different versions of that. It may have been made by Celebrimbor. It may have come from Valinor. Either Celebrimbor gave it directly to Galadriel because he loved her, or it was lost in Beleriand and then found, and then Gandalf gave it to her. There's different versions of the story, so keep that in mind from the previous question. But she had the Elisar, and sort of the version that we want to go with, I think, here is that Gandalf gave it to her, and that he told her sort of a prophecy that she would give it to the man who would become king. She wound up giving it to her daughter, Celebrian, and Celebrian gave it to her daughter, Arwen. And then Arwen realized that she wanted to give it to Aragorn. But the prophecy, and Aragorn's all about prophecies, the prophecy was that Galadriel would give it to Aragorn. So Arwen gave it back to Galadriel so that she can hand it to Aragorn. It was a whole thing, right? But in the middle there was Celebrian. Now, what happened to Celebrian? Why don't we see her? She was waylaid by orcs. She was captured. She was tortured, and she was poisoned. It was a bad, bad thing that happened, right? And she was rescued by her sons, Elodin and Elrohir, and brought back to Imladris, or Rivendell if you prefer that name. And Elrond healed her, but she had enough. She left Middle-earth. She went west to Valinor, because after that kind of thing, who wants to stick around, right? Who could blame her? She's waiting there. It was said that Arwen had a message for her mother, probably a goodbye, since she would never see her again, since she chose to be mortal, that she passed along with Frodo. So yeah, that's Celebrian, and the Calathiel story, that was the fan fiction story from earlier, borrowed heavily from that. You know, somebody even commented on that saying, that sounds like Celebrian, right? And I said, well, it's a fan fiction. It's sort of based on that, you know. Their version was a little more extreme, I don't want to get too much into it, but it was a little more Game of Thronesy. But yeah. So anyway, that's all the questions that I have to answer today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. This is the longest video. I didn't expect to wax so poetic about things. Hopefully I can keep it under an hour next week, but hopefully you guys don't mind. I found out something interesting recently, actually, that even though I only have something like 9 videos, not counting this one. Let's see, how many videos do I have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, there's 9 videos out, and they're all under an hour, right? Some of them are even, you know, like 39 minutes, 38 minutes, the first one. So I found out something interesting. You guys are really not only watching the whole of my videos, but you are watching them repeatedly, which I love, because I have reached, with only 9 videos, each under an hour long, I have got an achievement here, 50 hours of watch time within 10 days. So that's pretty cool, right? That's pretty cool. So anyway, guys, I'll see you guys next week. It's going to be on time. It's going to be on Wednesday. I was just a little tired and couldn't get to it. Send me your questions. Goodbye.